The rain came down in relentless, blinding sheets, turning the winding asphalt of West Virginia's Route 77 into a slick, black mirror reflecting nothing but the angry sky. Leo was on his 10th hour behind the wheel, his Uber shift stretching deep into the witching hours. His eyelids felt like lead weights, and the hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers was doing little to keep him alert. This particular stretch of road, cutting through dense Appalachian forest, was notorious. Locals traded stories about it over beers and coffee. Tales of strange lights, phantom sounds, and the unnerving feeling of being watched from the dark, imposing trees that crowded the shoulder. Leo, a pragmatist by nature, usually dismissed such talk as simple folklore, the kind of ghost stories bored people invent to make a lonely road more interesting. But tonight, with the world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and water, a primal sort of unease began to creep into the cabin of his sedan, colder and more invasive than the draft seeping through the old door seals. He just wanted to log off and head home, but one last ride request had pinged, promising a decent fare that he couldn't afford to ignore in these lean times. Rounding a particularly sharp bend, his high beams cut through the deluge and illuminated a solitary figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, shockingly out of place in the tempest. She wore a simple, light-colored dress that was now soaked through and clinging to her slender frame, her long, dark hair plastered to her face and shoulders. She didn't have a coat, an umbrella, or any luggage, just herself, standing utterly still with one hand raised tentatively, not in a frantic wave, but a quiet, almost pleading gesture. Leo's first thought was that her car must have broken down, but a quick scan of the roadside revealed nothing. His gut screamed at him to keep driving, to ignore the strange apparition and chalk it up to a tired mind playing tricks on him. But his conscience and the ingrained protocol of his job took over. Leaving someone, especially a woman, alone, stranded in a storm like this on a road so infamous, felt like a betrayal of basic human decency. With a sigh that fogged the inside of his window, he slowed the car to a halt, the tires hissing on the wet pavement, and flicked the switch to unlock the passenger doors. The back door opened with a soft click, and a wave of frigid air, far colder than the stormy night should have allowed, swept into the car, raising the hairs on Leo's arms. The woman slid into the back seat without a word. "Ma'am? Are you all right?" Leo asked, his voice sounding thin against the drumming of the rain. She didn't respond verbally, but leaned forward slightly, extending a pale, trembling hand. In her palm was a small, neatly folded piece of paper, already damp from the rain. He took it and unfolded it. An address was written on it in delicate, old-fashioned cursive. 147B Whisper Creek Lane. He knew the area, or at least he thought he did. It was a few miles further down the route, near an old, forgotten part of the county. He keyed the address into his GPS, which struggled for a moment before confirming the location. "No problem, I can get you there," he said, trying to force a reassuring tone into his voice. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her head was bowed, her wet hair obscuring her face completely, and she remained unnervingly silent,
her hands folded primly in her lap. The drive was the most unnerving 10 minutes of Leo's life. The silence from the back seat was absolute, a heavy, oppressive void that seemed to absorb all other sounds. Even the roar of the storm outside felt distant and muffled. He tried to make small talk once or twice. "Nasty weather we're having," and "hope you haven't been waiting out there long." But his words simply hung in the air, unanswered, before dissipating into the tense quiet. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, but her posture never changed. She was like a statue, a porcelain doll left out in the rain. A strange floral scent, like wilting lilies, began to fill the car, a sweet but cloying aroma that made his stomach churn. The unease he'd felt earlier had now blossomed into a full-blown sense of dread. Every instinct was telling him that something was profoundly wrong. He just wanted the ride to be over. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, focusing on the sliver of road illuminated by his headlights and counting down the miles on his GPS.
As the GPS announced, "You are approaching your destination," Leo prepared to make the final turn. He glanced down at the screen for just a second to confirm the sharp left onto the gravel lane. When he looked back up and checked his rearview mirror to announce their arrival, his heart leaped into his throat and hammered against his ribs. The back seat was empty. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. He spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief and panic. She was gone. It wasn't possible. He hadn't heard the door open, and the car had been moving the entire time. Chillingly, he noticed the seatbelt on the passenger side was still buckled, clicked securely into its latch over an empty, damp seat. The cold air that had entered with her was gone, and the sickly sweet smell of lilies had vanished, replaced by the mundane scent of wet upholstery and stale air freshener. He was alone, his breath fogging the glass, his mind racing to find a rational explanation where there was none. She had simply dematerialized. Shaking, but driven by a morbid need to see the journey through, Leo turned onto Whisper Creek Lane. The short gravel path ended abruptly at a pair of rusted, wrought-iron gates hanging precariously from crumbling stone pillars. Beyond them, illuminated by the sweep of his headlights, was an old, overgrown cemetery. Weathered tombstones, tilted and covered in moss, stood like silent, decaying teeth in the darkness. There were no houses, no buildings, nothing but the forgotten graves of the long dead. The address she had given him was for this place. The realization sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. He threw the car into reverse, his tires spitting gravel, and sped away from the cemetery as fast as he could, not looking back. He didn't stop until he reached the bright fluorescent safety of a 24-hour gas station 10 miles down the highway, his hands trembling too much to even hold his coffee steady. He babbled his story to the night clerk, a weary-looking old man who listened patiently, without a hint of surprise. When Leo finished, the clerk simply nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a sad sort of pity. "Son," he said, his voice a low rasp, "you just gave a ride to Eleanor. Every year, on the anniversary of her accident, she tries to get home." He explained that in 1958, a young woman named Eleanor was killed in a head-on collision on Route 77 while on her way to her own wedding reception. Her fiancé had bought them a small plot of land and was building them a house on Whisper Creek Lane. They buried her in the family plot, right where the house was supposed to be. "You're not the first driver she's flagged down," the old man added, wiping the counter with a rag. "And you won't be the last. She just wants to get to the home she never had." Leo stared into his coffee, the steam rising like a ghostly mist. He never drove that stretch of Route 77 at night again.
Marcus navigated the humid late-night streets on the outskirts of New Orleans, the air thick with the smell of decay and sweet olive. His Lyft app directed him to a pickup near the skeletal remains of the old Belle Reve Asylum, a place long abandoned and steeped in dark local legends. The massive Gothic structure was a silhouette against the moonless sky, its empty windows like hollow eye sockets staring out into the darkness. People said the place was cursed, haunted by the tormented souls of patients who had been subjected to horrific experimental treatments. Marcus wasn't a superstitious man, but even he felt a prickle of unease as he pulled up to the designated spot on the quiet, overgrown street. He waited for a few minutes, the silence broken only by the chirping of cicadas. He was about to cancel the ride when he heard it, a faint, tinny melody, like a child's lullaby, seeming to emanate from somewhere just outside his car. He scanned the darkened street, seeing nothing, and dismissed it as his imagination, until the sound came again, clearer this time, and seemingly from the rear of his vehicle. Frowning, he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the humid air clinging to him like a shroud. The music had stopped. He walked to the back of his Honda Accord, listening intently. Silence. He checked the back seat through the window. It was empty. Convinced he was just tired and hearing things, he was about to get back in when the melody started once more, soft and undeniably coming from inside his trunk. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He lived alone, and he was meticulous about his car. He knew for a fact there was nothing in his trunk besides a spare tire and a roadside emergency kit. Had a previous passenger left something? Against his better judgment, he unlocked the trunk and slowly lifted the lid. There, nestled in the corner, on top of the carpeted floor, was a small tarnished silver music box, intricately carved with faded cherubs and vines. He had never seen it before in his life. He felt a powerful urge to slam the trunk shut and drive away, but a strange curiosity compelled him to pick it up.
The metal was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. As his fingers brushed against it, the music stopped abruptly. The box was heavier than it looked, and a sense of profound sadness seemed to radiate from it. He couldn't explain it, but holding the object felt wrong, like he was intruding on a private grief. He didn't want it in his car. Looking around the desolate street, he saw a drainage ditch overgrown with weeds a few yards away. With a feeling of mingled guilt and revulsion, he walked over and tossed the music box into the ditch, where it landed with a soft, metallic thud. He didn't wait to see if the music started again. He quickly got back into his car, canceled the phantom ride request that had brought him to this forsaken place, and drove home. The image of the asylum's dark windows burned into his mind. He tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling himself it was just a weird prank or a bizarre coincidence, but the eerie lullaby echoed in the back of his mind for the rest of the night. The next morning, his phone rang, jarring him from a restless sleep. It was his sister, her voice choked with panic.
"Marcus, it's Lily," she sobbed. "Something's wrong. She won't wake up." His blood ran cold. Lily was his 7-year-old niece, a bright and cheerful girl he adored. He raced to the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He found his sister in the waiting room of the pediatric ICU, her face pale and tear-streaked. A doctor explained that Lily had slipped into an unexplained coma during the night. Her vitals were stable, but she was completely unresponsive. They had run every test they could think of, but there was no medical reason for her condition. She was, for all intents and purposes, a perfectly healthy child who was simply gone. Marcus felt a wave of helplessness wash over him as he stood by his sister's side, staring through the glass at his small niece lying still in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and tubes.
He went into the room to sit with her, his heart aching. As he sat down, his eyes fell upon the bedside table. There, next to a glass of water and a get-well card from her class, was a small tarnished silver music box. It was identical to the one he had thrown into the ditch the night before. He stared at it, his breath catching in his chest. "Where did that come from?" he asked his sister, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at it, confused. "That's Nana's," she said. "It's a family heirloom. I don't know how it got here. It's been in a box in my attic for years. The nurse night said she found it in Lily's hands this morning when she came in to check on her." A chilling realization began to dawn on Marcus, a horrifying connection forming in his mind. The asylum, the phantom ride, the music box in his trunk. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a curse, and attachment. The doctor came in a few moments later with an update, though there was no new information. "One thing is odd," he said, looking at his chart. "The nurses on the night shift noted that Lily was humming in her sleep just before she became unresponsive. A very specific, old-fashioned sounding tune." He hummed a few bars of the melody, and Marcus felt the last of the color drain from his face. It was the exact same lullaby he had heard coming from the trunk of his car. The spirit from the asylum, a lost child perhaps, had attached itself to him. The music box in his trunk wasn't the original. It was an echo, a psychic manifestation of the cursed object. When he had discarded it, the entity had sought the real thing, finding it through his connection to his family. It had found his niece, and now it wouldn't let her go. He was responsible. The weight of that knowledge was heavier and colder than any haunted object.
He never told his sister the full story, unable to bear the burden of explaining the supernatural horror he had brought to their family. He returned to the ditch near the asylum, but the music box he had thrown was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Lily remained in her coma for 3 agonizing weeks, the doctors completely baffled, before one morning she simply woke up, with no memory of what had happened. The antique music box on her nightstand, however, was found to be shattered, its delicate mechanism broken beyond repair. Marcus quit his job as a Lyft driver the following day. He now understands that some places are best left alone, and that when you drive through the darkest corners of the world, you never know what kind of passenger might decide to hitch a ride, not just in your car, but in your life, seeking a connection to the world of the living through anyone it can find.
The fog on California's Pacific Coast Highway was a living entity, a thick, gray beast that swallowed the headlights of David's Prius and reduced the world to a 10-foot bubble of visibility. It was well past 2 a.m.,
and the winding coastal road, beautiful by day, was a treacherous ribbon of asphalt clinging to a cliffside that dropped into an unseen, roaring ocean. David was exhausted, his body aching from a long night of ferrying tourists and late-night workers around Monterey. He was about to call it a night when a final fare request came through. The pickup location was unusual, a small, desolate, scenic overlook known locally as Lover's Leap, a place with a tragic history. Still, the drop-off was on his way home, and the payout was substantial. He accepted, pulling into the empty gravel turnout where the fog was so dense it swirled like smoke. A young man, barely in his 20s, emerged from the mist, looking lost and forlorn. He was wearing only a thin jacket, which was soaked through with the damp coastal air. The young man slid into the back seat, the door closing with a quiet thud. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice soft and trembling slightly. "Didn't think anyone would come out this far in this weather." David offered a tired smile. "No problem. Where to?" The passenger gave him an address in a quiet residential neighborhood a few miles inland. As they pulled back onto the highway, David noticed the passenger was shivering, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Tough night?" David asked gently, trying to break the heavy silence. The young man let out a long, shaky breath. "You could say that," he whispered. After a moment, the words tumbled out of him in a torrent of grief. "She left me, my girlfriend, said I wasn't enough for her, that I'd never be enough." The raw pain in his voice was palpable, a universal sorrow that David knew all too well from his own past heartbreaks. It was a pain that felt all-consuming, especially when you were young.
David listened patiently, his own memories of a devastating breakup from years ago bubbling to the surface. He remembered the feeling of worthlessness, the gaping void where a future used to be. Instead of offering empty platitudes, he decided to speak from the heart. "Listen, man," he began, his eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. "I've been there. I know it feels like the end of the world right now. It feels like a judgment on you, like you failed some kind of cosmic test. But it's not. I promise you, it's not. You didn't lose her because you weren't enough. You lost her because you weren't right for each other, and that's a whole different thing. Someone leaving you doesn't decrease your value. It just means their journey is on a different path." He spoke for several minutes, sharing his own story of how he eventually found happiness after thinking it was impossible, his words filling the small, warm car with a sense of genuine empathy. The young man in the back was silent for a long time after David finished speaking. David worried he might have overstepped, that his unsolicited advice had been unwelcome. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the passenger looking out the window, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased slightly. "Thank you," the young man said, his voice thick with emotion. I really needed to hear that." They drove the rest of the way in a more comfortable silence. When they reached the destination, a quiet suburban street lined with sleeping houses, the young man opened the door. "Thank you, sir, for your kind words," he said. And for the first time, he looked directly at David, his eyes conveying a profound and startling sense of gratitude. Then he stepped out and vanished into the fog-shrouded street before David could even process the payment notification on his phone.
David felt a strange sense of peace as he drove home, It was one of those rare rides that felt like more than just a transaction. It felt like a moment of human connection, a small act of kindness that might have made a real difference in a stranger's life. He thought about the young man for the next couple of days, hoping he was doing okay. 2 days later, while taking a break between fares, he was scrolling through a local news website on his phone when a headline caught his eye. Community remembers local youth on 1-year anniversary of PCH tragedy. Curious, he clicked the article. It detailed the story of a 21-year-old college student who had driven his car off the cliffs at the Lover's Leap scenic overlook exactly 1 year ago that week, devastated after a bad breakup. The article included a picture of the young man. David's phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor of his car. It was him. The same face, the same sad eyes, the same young man he had picked up in the fog 2 nights before. He read the article again, his heart pounding. It quoted the young man's grieving mother. "He was such a gentle soul," she said through tears. "He felt things so deeply." His last journal entry was just him questioning his own worth, wondering if he would ever be good enough for anyone. "I just wish he could have known how much he was loved, how worthy he truly was." The words hit David like a physical blow. The passenger hadn't been a heartbroken young man. He had been a ghost, a spirit, trapped in a loop of his final moments of pain and despair, still waiting on that foggy overlook. A chill that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning washed over David. He realized the purpose of that final phantom fare. He hadn't just been a driver, he had been an answer to a year-old prayer. The ghost of that young man had needed to hear one last time that he was worthy, that his value wasn't defined by someone else's departure. David's kind words, spoken from a place of shared experience, had offered a final piece of comfort to a tormented spirit, perhaps allowing him to finally find peace and move on from the lonely cliffside where his life had ended. David looked out at the bustling city street, but all he could see was the fog on the PCH. He understood now that sometimes the lost souls on the side of the road aren't looking for a ride to a physical destination, but for a final, kind word to help them on their journey home.